Right, so welcome everyone, and thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Andy Laird. I'm the Managing Director of Mutual Ventures, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our Fringe event, which we're co-hosting with Bates Wells. We're both affiliate members of CCIN and very proud to be so. Today we'll be considering how a cooperative framework can ensure the public services and businesses are fully connected to the communities they serve. So local authorities, public services, community leaders, as everyone knows, they're facing an unprecedented set of challenges as they look to lead their local areas out of the COVID-19 crisis. However, recovery, as I think we would all appreciate, it's not about just returning to business as usual. So across the country, we've seen a lot of cooperation within communities and also between formal public services and local groups. And we really want to try and think of ways to lock in some of that, because I think we would all appreciate that in a crisis people pull together, but as things return to normal, people can tend to drift back to the way things were, back into their own silos. So we want to try and avoid that. So without a conscious effort, I think that this will happen. And as part of today, we want to introduce a framework which might help you in your area think about how to do some of that locking in. So by way of introduction, Mutual Ventures is a consultancy that specializes in public service design and implementation. We're very passionate about making public services better, more sustainable, and more connected to communities. And the work we do is all about trying to support local areas to achieve that. We work with local authorities, government departments, NHS, organisations, charities and social enterprises. I'm also delighted to introduce our co-host today, Bates Wells. Bates Wells is the leading law firm in this space. We work with them on many projects looking at how to deliver public services differently, and we're always really impressed by how their straightforward approach and understanding of the challenging contexts that many councils face. They are a very human law firm, when I think quite a few law firms don't seem that way. A good example of our joint working is on the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sports Mutual Support Programme, which helps public service organisations to consider the public service mutuals, which includes cooperative models as an option. So before I introduce the panel, I want to talk a little bit about housekeeping. So it is a roundtable format, so it is designed to be quite a small group where everybody gets a chance to speak. So please put your questions in the Q&A function or raise your hand. And as chair, I'll do my best to make sure that everybody has an opportunity. And if we don't get to all the questions, we will address them afterwards to you individually. So for today's session, we have an excellent panel. First of all, I'd like to introduce Rachel Law. Rachel's the Chief Executive of PossAbilities Community Interest Company. PossAbilities is a Rochdale-based social enterprise delivering CQC outstanding adult social care services, but they aren't just in Rochdale, they are across the Northwest. Rachel was the head of the Learning Disability Provider Services at the council before spinning the service out into a public service mutual, which is very much led and influenced by staff. Secondly, I'd like to introduce Mike O'Keefe. Mike is the head of commissioning for mental health and learning disability at Rochdale Council. Of course, Rochdale Council is a member of the CCIN, and Mike works very closely with Rachel, particularly during this crisis. Next up is Abbie Rumbold, who's a partner at Bates Wells. As well as being a top lawyer in the field of cooperatives, mutuals and social enterprises, Abbie was one of the creators of the community interest company concept. And finally, Jamie McMahon is my colleague from Mutual Ventures, and he leads our cooperative work. Jamie has a charity background and in a former life was a political advisor to a core city local authority. So that's us. But before we dive into questions, I'm going to ask Jamie to briefly introduce the framework for our discussion, which is our cooperative approach to recovery. Jamie, over to you.
Thank you. Just briefly to summarise and introduce the work that we've been doing during the COVID-19 crisis. We recognise that, I think members of the CCIN recognise more than anyone else, that if a local authority wants to lead its communities out of COVID-19 to a place that is stronger, then it needs to ensure that cooperation underpins every level of its work. And for us, that very much starts at the top. So it's about working collaboratively with partner organisations, whether they be the CCG, local NHS hospitals, other organisations, to make sure that by working together, we can come back stronger and break down those organisational barriers. And a lot of progress was done on that during the height of lockdown, but it's about embedding that change. Secondly, it's about how we can make people at the heart of public services. Public service is not something that are done to people, but something that is part of their everyday lives, and give them that greater sense of ownership, particularly building upon the surge of public support we've seen with the Clap for Carers and other initiatives that lockdown really brought to the front of our minds. Thirdly, for us, it's about how do we get businesses that are connected to their communities. You know, local people have proven that they're willing to go above and beyond to support those local businesses that are based in their communities, that invest back into their local area. But what role do local authorities have in fostering those kind of community-based businesses, whether they be more corporate entities or whether they be, like Rachel, organisations that straddle both sides of the public sector / business divide? And then one of the topics that's been discussed at this conference is about mutual aid groups. How do we work with neighbourhoods and streets to foster that collective spirit and make sure that they work together to help each other? And finally, and it's a topic we've discussed for years in public services, how can councils proactively work with individuals to make sure that they look after themselves and they support themselves as much as possible? So we believe we've produced a framework for both our discussion today, but also a framework which, if adopted by any local authority from top to bottom, could really embed cooperation at every level and make sure that the recovery from COVID takes us back to somewhere stronger, somewhere better, and one that's built around local people. So really looking forward to discussing that and going into more detail as we go through.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Jamie. Is my sound okay? I know you were mentioning there that it was a little bit. Okay, great. So without further ado, let's get into the questions, and do raise your hand or put anything on the Q&A function if you would like to ask a question. So Rachel, my first question is for you. So as the Chief Executive of a community-based organisation, how were you able to react to the initial crisis, and being very much embedded in the community, did that make a difference?
Yeah, I think so. So I think, like every provider, there was we were really anxious about what was going to be thrust upon us, really. We immediately reg-rated some of our services and the people that accessed our services and looked at priority areas. We were also very fortunate to get some funding up front from the local authority in relation to, you know, supporting us, because obviously our costs were increasing, people were going off sick, we were covering high levels of sickness. We have the Cherwell Wellbeing Hub, which is open to the community. So we often have people that access the hub that we don't support. And because we are aware of some people that potentially could be vulnerable, during the beginning of the pandemic and ongoing, we were able to keep in contact with those individuals to make sure that they were okay and they had everything that they needed. We also supported family members. So some family members that were shielding in terms of our day service families, we went shopping, we got prescriptions for them, etc. And staff, whilst they were really anxious, they were redeployed into different service areas. Some staff members drove 30, 40 miles to provide support in a different area, just because they bought into PossAbilities. So we were really quite humbled just by you know, the support that we received off our staff members. We did have some discussions with Mike about one of our respite buildings, which we closed. We had early discussions about giving it over to the local authority to have some sort of step down service for people that were COVID positive, but could be discharged from hospital but still needed some sort of nursing support if the hospitals become overwhelmed.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like you were able to move with great agility, for want of a better word, being the type of organisation you are and based in the community and having those staff who are so committed, whereas potentially other types of organisation might have been more to the letter of the contract almost, whereas you've responded to what's been needed.
Yeah, and I think that, we really, I mean, I'll talk, later on about some of the stuff that we do, but, people often talk about being part of the community, but at PossAbilities, we really engage the community, and we do lots of community events. So we're so embedded within the community that we understand about people's needs, really. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. So Mike, over to you now. So you work closely with organisations like PossAbilities. When the pandemic hit, how did you respond, and how were organisations like PossAbilities well placed to help?
Yeah. Well, I guess like probably all local authorities and clinical commissioning groups, very, very early on, we got ourselves organised into an emergency planning mode and put our command structures in place for daily decision making with the executives and directors, and we fairly quickly got meetings via videos with the various sectors, so residential for older people, nursing homes, home care, and supported living. So we got the key providers on board and got the communication channels open very quickly.
Yeah.
So Rachel talks about being at the heart of the community, which her service is. It's a big service. It's our largest learning disability service. I think the key though was having strong working relationships previous to the outbreak. So it was fairly straightforward in terms of having conversations, and as you mentioned previously, the contract didn't matter. It was about how we figure things out. So the social value aspect of it, as Rachel's just talked about, was key because services like Rachel's were at the heart of the community. They know what makes how the community ticks, the thinking, and the services that have been set up have had that social value embedded within it. So they deliver their contract, but they deliver a lot more. And with services, particularly PossAbilities, it seems like that it's just second nature. It's not a great, they don't make a big song and dance out of it. They just do it, and then it's easy for the community to get involved with people with disabilities. She talks about the wellbeing service. Well, that's going to come into its own as well, because what we know is from data from Greater Manchester is that incidence of mental health is now rising as an indirect result of COVID. And the predictions are between 15 and 30% additional pressure on mental health services. So we're really relying on what's going on in the community and how service can adjust to this new phenomena that we're having to deal with. Without strong relations pre-pandemic with key providers, then you'd be starting from scratch and setting up how you're going to operate. Well, we know how we operate with each other to deliver services, and there's always issues, and Rachel's the sort of person who was quite in your face with the issues, gets it out there in the open, so we can deal with it fairly quickly as well when issues do arise, which is appreciated. But yeah, we quickly got into that sort of a decision making arena pretty quickly. And so we initially meeting as a leadership team in the council and the CCG morning and evening. As we got into it, they just trailed off to evenings, and then it's been once a week. But as we've seen the increase in positive incidents,
Mm-hmm.
that started to, we're putting that back in place now. And what we've seen this week is increasing incidents in supported living. So we've now put further communication meetings in with providers on a weekly basis to deal with that. So as the situation changes, we've tried to adapt our communication to either escalate it or downgrade it.
Yeah.
And working with possibilities and providers, giving them the exact position as we see it, and having the debate has been really key. Example of that is Greater Manchester is a site for testing in for services where there is a communal element. So things like supported living and extra care. There's going to be some new government guidance out, but we're a test site for that, and we chose Possibilities to be our local test site because we knew it'd be straightforward. We've basically said to Rachel, "Will you be it?" And she just says, "Yeah," and then got on with it. And it's that sort of thing that is really helpful.
Yeah.
And that's starting next week, and that'll be a feature of the guidance, national guidance, when it comes out. Because I think NHS England wanted an urban area where there was significant issues, i.e. Greater Manchester, back in sort of late July, August. So we signed up for that, knowing that it wouldn't be a problem. But
Yeah.
we couldn't sign up for that unless we did, if we thought there would be a problem. But there isn't, and like Possibilities is just getting on with it, and we'll learn a lot from it. And I think that's another thing, really. If we're working together, we're learning all the time then,
Yeah.
and sort of
Yeah.
figuring things out together.
So just on that relationship with Possibilities, you, Rochdale, I will say, we're lucky enough to have an organization like Possibilities
Yeah,
operating within their patch. Other councils don't necessarily, or maybe have had organizations like this in the past, but because of rather short-term commissioning
yeah,
ambitions, have
yeah.
cancelled those contracts and moved things. And actually now they're probably regretting that.
Well, yes. I mean, obviously, I can't speak for other areas,
No.
uh, but I think that we've got really strong relationships with our providers. Um, we, well, for example, where there's been an outbreak, where we've seen positive cases, we've had meetings with the owners of the businesses, if it's sort of a nursing home or if it's a larger organisation. And I think those meetings have been really positive because we've together with the infection control team, the social work team, the provider and the commissioner has figured out an action plan individually. And then
Mm.
what we've done, we've shared those action plans and the key learning points from them through our communication channels.
Yeah.
But we've got that because I think we've had really good relationships pre-COVID with our provider bases. As I say, there's always issues, with money, the ebb and flow of money. But essentially, we've maintained relationships with all our providers through previously, and certainly through this, it's um, it's
Yeah.
been really helpful. I mean, I get a
Yeah.
sense of when I'm chairing meetings, I get a sense that we're all on board,
Yeah.
with the providers, and it's sort of a feel good factor really, even though we're dealing with these difficult issues.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, we were on it before this with me and Rach. Were on a meeting with all our providers, and we're inviting public health, the infection control team to discuss what's happening.
Yeah.
And their feedback at the start of it was really thanking providers for basically figuring out how to deal with it.
Yeah.
You've got the guidelines, and I know providers that we chuck in loads of guidelines at them, and they've had to absorb that and then figure out on the ground how they deal with the issues. And hearing their stories and how they're dealing with it can help us refine our approach overall across the piece.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
it's the old adage that we need providers more than they need us.
Yeah. Rachel, just what I've got another question for you before um, bringing in Abbie and Jamie. So a particular group that's been under pressure has been those reliant upon day services, which weren't feasible to their full extent, or if any extent, during the height of the lockdown. How did your team respond, and how did you manage to help those families?
Yeah, so we had our business continuity plan in place, which obviously we implemented at the beginning of COVID, and we rag-rated family members that would go into crisis without some sort of support. So we obviously shut all our day services down, all our buildings, and we went to a community offer, so that if people were going in crisis, we went and supported them in the community, in the homes really during lockdown, and just gave people a break. What's been really helpful with Rochdale is they've agreed to continue to pay on assessment rather than what's been actually delivered, because currently our day services have reopened, but they're running at 60% occupancy because of social distancing. And we are working with Rochdale to remodel day service provision, which is quite exciting, really, because what you've got to think about is, yes, we're in the middle of a huge crisis, but there are some opportunities that are going to come out of this crisis. So we've just developed an online platform, or in the process of developing it, called the Curiosity Box. Mm-hmm. It's a platform online, and we're looking at doing some fun stuff that we can engage service users with, but also have some qualifications on there, so they can undertake some learning and get a qualification at the end of it. So that's quite exciting. We've shared that with Rochdale Council, and we were really quite impressed with some of our early designs on that. Yeah. We have the farm and the wellbeing garden at our Sherwell Centre, which I've mentioned earlier, is a hub. We have opened up that to the community, and that's just a safe space where people can go to sort of let off steam. And as well, it's important to remember that staff are part of the community, and staff have been overwhelmed. You know, we've been asking them to go in and work with people who are potentially who have got positive tests of COVID. So the board agreed that around about June, July time, for those that have worked throughout the pandemic, that they got a £250 voucher. And we paid the tax and national insurance on that, just as a way of thanking people. We've also got a lodge at Ribby Hall, which we purchased a few years ago, and we have reduced the prices on those so that staff can get away and have a holiday, a staycation. So it's important to support staff and the wellbeing. We've just trained 20 staff members to be mental health champions. So it's important to remember that staff are as well part of the community, and you know, you must continue to support them in a really difficult time.
Okay, thanks, Rachel. So just I've noticed that there's a few questions coming in now, but I just have got one or two for Abbie and Jamie. So for local authorities looking to embed this kind of community-based working into public services, you know, what might they do? So Abbie, a question for you is, what way can councils and communities hardwire some of this stuff into how they operate within businesses and social enterprises?
Yeah, I mean, I can talk to that, but I just first of all just wanted to say that I could literally listen to Rachel and Mike all day. It's just really fascinating for me just hear the kind of the story and how people have responded, and just so kind of heartwarming, I guess, to see the kind of the relationship between the sort of the council and the provider, because you so often hear that as being described negatively, as a sort of difficult from both perspectives, and actually to just see sort of two people that are overcoming in a really challenging situation and just actually getting to the heart of what needs to be done in just a really efficient and effective way. I sort of feel like central government has something to learn from some of the things that you're doing.
Thank you.
But so in terms of, I mean, hardwiring it, the way in which councils can work with some of these community organisations, I think there's a whole range of different ways that you can fold the community into a charity or a social enterprise or a mutual. And when we've seen that done, it's been, and when we've worked with people to help them to do it, it's been a range of different things that they're trying to do. And I think what Rachel was describing about who is the community, when you're saying, well, staff are part of the community and the different families that you work with, but also the general public. And I think often when you're starting to work with an organisation, it's really identifying all those levels of community and what it is that you want them, what you want their involvement to be. So we often sort of, or I often think of it as a kind of spectrum really, where you start at kind of just having a voice, and then you move towards sort of at the other end of the spectrum, having real control over an organisation. And then you think of the different ways that you can involve the community at those different levels. So in terms of having a voice, that could be just being a kind of staff culture, which is that you talk to people and you listen to what they're saying and you're in and around them. Or it can be, you know, I know other organisations that are sort of much larger, where they have a kind of a sort of hour each week where the chief executive just gets online and people can just sort of, you know, plug in questions. So there's the kind of sense of just sort of voice and how do you feed into people. And then at the other end, there's, or I suppose in the middle, you have some things like a sort of associate membership. So people can come in and they can come to formal meetings or informal meetings. Then real membership, where they actually own the organisation. And then finally, you get to the very sort of formal kind of, sort of cooperative setting that we sort of think of when we think of the kind of 19th century and the kind of, you know, brilliant cooperatives that started in the north, and you know, the idea of people vote and they appoint people to the board, and that's how the organisation runs. And I think all of those work quite well, but you need to think about the different levels of the community and what people actually want, because quite often I think people start with a feeling of, I've got to get all of the community involved, whereas most people, although they'll have a view on, I don't know, how their local green space is presented, or they might have a view on the sort of library opening hours, they're not prepared to really make a commitment and come along and really engage in what's going on, but they still do want to have some kind of a voice. Whereas others, you can see where you can end up in a kind of stasis type situation where you're trying to have so many voices at the table and you've given them perhaps too much control over the organisation, that the kind of dynamic decision making that Rachel and Mike were able to do, where they just said, this is the problem, let's sort it out, we'll get it done, just can't happen because you're trying to pull in so many different people. There are legally different ways to do that, but I think it's really important to be clear about what you want and what the kind of costs are of that.
Thanks, Abbie. And just while I have you, there's a question on the chat about whether you think the pandemic has shifted the dial, in inverted commas, when it comes to council's attitudes to risks around procurement, you know, data sharing and things. Have you seen any movement there?
I mean, it's been interesting. I mean, there's definitely been some government guidance which has been helpful in terms of reducing risks in certain areas. So for example, around insolvency, they've reduced some of the risks for directors around insolvency, and that's meant that providers have felt more comfortable in taking financial risks, I think. But in terms of local authorities' attitudes to procurement, this is a kind of crazy scenario, and but I don't think it changes people's nervousness about doing something for which they're held accountable. I mean, my kind of, well, I mean, having said that, with mention of central government, where they seem to have been able to put out a number of contracts without procurement processes that we would probably prefer them to have gone through. But at a local community level, I haven't seen that, except that I think often this is about the politics of the situation. I think the sort of poor sort of procurement officer is often blamed for being the kind of person that says no, or is being difficult, or you know, insisting on the letter of the law. But actually it's about whether or not they've got senior management support, and more importantly, political support for the risks that they're taking. And I think in some cases, for some local authorities, the pressure on them politically to get things done has meant that they're more keen to take risks, and that gives, you know, procurement officers, you know, a little bit more cover, frankly. We've definitely seen some examples where the attitude has been, I mean, I guess it does depend on leadership, as you say, but the attitude has been, look, just work this out and we'll worry about who funded what later on.
And that, you know, that can't last forever, or else it'll be an awful mess to clear up. Jamie, if I can bring you in now, from the support that you've been providing to councils considering how to look at their strategy after this, I mean, what sort of approaches are they taking?
I think there's a real realization that the kind of things we're talking about can't be done overnight as much as there is a desire to do it. And I think procurement is a good example where you have, as we talked about, you've got very well-meaning, diligent officers, but unless they feel they've got that support coming from the very top to go down a more cooperative approach, to make decisions with bigger things in mind than the cost of the services, I think organisations are realising that if they are going to, when they come out of this situation, they need to make sure that that is a strategy that's embedded top to bottom of the organisation and underpins everything that they do. And I think even in this conference, the examples we've seen from councils like Plymouth, where this has been a 5-10 year, if not more, journey to become truly cooperatives in their approach. So I think let's also not pretend that the councils we're talking to aren't also in an even worse financial position than they were 6 months ago, which was hardly a wealth of riches and money flowing through the door. So there's a real desire, I think, on the part of many councils to try and do things differently, to try and embed those kind of strategies and approaches that we've talked about, but a realization that that is going to be part of a 5-10 year journey, and that they need to both have a strategy that underpins it and then support officers like Mike to take that forward and deliver it in a way that allows them to create and support organisations like PossAbilities, that next time we have a crisis, hopefully never as bad as this, the structure and framework is in place. And I think that's the kind of conversations that we're having that I think are fascinating, but actually really about trying to genuinely move the needle for the long term, rather than just trying to crack paper over some of the edges that have been shown up during the height of the pandemic.
I think that's right. And I think for the local authorities that we're working with, who I think are responding really well, they're putting the effort in right now to think about their strategy and where they want to be, rather than just frantically recovering to maybe where they were. So I think it's really important to think about it like that. And some areas are making use of the fact that they have all of the local leaders through Gold Command, etc., who are already meeting regularly. They're tagging on half an hour to those tactical meetings to talk about what their local area should look like over the next 5 to 10 years. So it's really encouraging to see that. So just going back to some of the questions that are coming through here, there's one for Mike and Rachel, quite a very serious question, which I'm sure is on your minds, which is, what does the winter look like now, coming up, in terms of the virus and what things might change? So I don't know, Mike or Rachel, who wants to have a go with that one first? Mike or Rachel?
Yeah.
Mike.
Okay, well, I mean, it's additional challenges across the piece, across the client group spectrum. We've been required to come up with recovery plans, and as we're doing that, we're having to adjust it because of the new outbreak situation. At the moment, we're figuring out what the new money from the government, how that's playing out, and how we can spend that. So the money's sort of come. We've been told roughly how much we're going to get, and we're figuring out how to spend that now. And the winter is looking like, potentially like, there's going to be organisations who may be struggling with the deployment of staff because of the situation. So we're really keen to figure out with those organisations how they're managing, and the restrictions with staffing are really, really tight, because it's about, you can't sort of share your staff like in previous crises. If there was an organisation with staffing difficulties, where you could call on others and ask for sort of help, but the dynamics of this crisis are so different. Again, another fallback is the use of agency staff. Well, there are issues with that with this crisis as well. So my worry is that, are we going to have enough staff who are available to provide services through the winter? across the spectrum, older people's nursing homes through to dynamic services where they're trying to figure out how to support people who are with disabilities who are isolating.
Yeah.
So that's my concern. How we're dealing with it, I think, is we're communicating with staff and understanding where an organisation's at and trying to work with them on each of these issues as they come up.
Yeah.
How we utilise the infection control grant will be mainly on workforce support, but we're talking to organisations now about how they're looking at their contingency plans. How they're maybe using single agencies to more on the nursing home sector, to be able to come in, and as a council, how we can support that, looking at our discharge to assess our hot sites for patients to be discharged with the virus, so things like that.
Yeah.
So,
okay, thanks, Mike. Rachel, if I could ask you specifically, so how is the fact that you are so embedded in the community and in constant contact with the community, and the fact that you involve the staff very much in the running of the organisation, how is that helping you plan for what is certain to be a really tough winter?
So I think, as you know, PossAbilities staff are, we have a staff advisory group, and they are associate members of PossAbilities. And right from spinning out of the local authority, they wanted this business to be a success. And they have gone over and above what I would have ever anticipated to make this business a success. So they're really bought in. So, we like Mike said, we are worried about the winter crisis, but, staff have gone over and above to support people that are self-isolating, that are waiting for positive tests. So, for example, in our respite unit, some staff members moved in and stayed there for a week and didn't go home, just to be able to support individuals. And I think, we've had a conversation with Mike this morning about there's a provider in Rochdale that the majority of the management team have been told to self-isolate. And I've said, look, they can access our management team. I know that our management team will be supportive. That doesn't mean to say they're going to go into services, but if they need some sort of support and advice to staff members working for that organisation, then our team will be more than happy to step in. So it really is about collaboration. It's about being open and transparent with your staff. So during the pandemic, we have sent out weekly, daily briefings, from the senior management team. We have had Zoom calls where we keep in touch with people. We can just touch base, because we used to do management visits. So it really is about the communication and engagement with your staff, really.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you. Abbie, you put up a question there about the link between the council and the CCG. Do you want to just put that in your own words?
I'm typing on my husband's laptop, and I thought I'd pressed, but then it went before I meant to. So sorry, it doesn't make any sense, that question.
Okay.
But what I was trying to say was just the link between the council and the CCG, and how that makes a difference really to you as a provider, Rachel, in being able to see that kind of perspective across the piece, and also to Mike in terms of his ability to bring in different perspectives. Because I know for some organisations, working with lots of different commissioners that aren't really joined up has been quite problematic.
Mike, do you want to answer that one for comment?
Yeah, if you go first, Mike.
Is he gone?
I think we might have lost Mike, maybe.
I think we might have just lost Mike, yeah, so...
Okay, whilst
Rachel, it's all on you.
do you want to take a swing at it, Rachel? Sorry.
I guess it has been difficult. I guess for PossAbilities, really, we just have a lead commissioner that we work with. So it's not necessarily that we've got the CCG or we've got Rochdale. It is just we just kind of liaise with a lead commissioner. So it's not been problematic in that sense. I think what has been problematic for organisations is around some of the different restrictions that we're facing. So for example, you know, we're working in all sorts of areas, and there's all sort of different local restrictions, and it's interpreting that which can get really quite difficult. And, you know, having those conversations with commissioners about the local restrictions and what that means. So for me, that is probably one of the current challenges at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. So Rachel, another question for you whilst we wait for Mike to come back. There's your organisation, and you have touched on this a bit, but I think for a lot of the people who will watch this and are interested in bringing a more cooperative approach into how they deliver public services, the pandemic and lockdown and all the rest of it doesn't lead itself to that way of working, you know, because it is the way that you run the organization or have done in the past. It's about people being in the center. It's about connecting with people. Or are you worried about kind of a longer term impact of distancing, or even, you know, next 6 to 12 months, what that impact might be on how you run the organization or the culture?
I am worried about that because anybody that's probably visited PossAbilities, we are really very much embedded within the local community. We have our head office, we have the people we support wandering around the and kind of have access to people, and that has changed. And I feel like the culture of our business has changed because of that, because we're not as sort of inclusive. So that does worry me, and it's about how we get back to being the organisation that we were before, and I think we need to give some consideration to that. Just in terms of some of your questions, so there is some schemes that PossAbilities is looking to be involved in. So, for example, the Kickstart scheme, which there's still lots of questions about how that will operate rather than answers. But you know, we do have we do use volunteers, and we, you know, to work with us. So we're looking at how we can get involved in that scheme to sort of get the community and volunteers involved. Yeah. We have a community map that we've just developed, and that is an app on your phone, and that identifies all the different types of services within Rochdale, Hayward and Middleton, and that could be, you know, and all the different activities that are going on. And within that, we're going to also have volunteers linked to each of those service areas. So again, really sort of engaging the community and you know, promoting the use of volunteering. But it's a worry, Andrew. I can't, you know, it's a worry.
Yeah. Mike, you're back. You
sorry about that.
Temporary, but that's okay. I just want to put Abbie had a really good question around the work between the council and the CCG. Now you wear both hats, I think. In terms of being a commissioner, has that made things a lot easier for you?
That's a good point. It's made it much more interesting. We're an integrated commissioning directorate, and my role covers CCG as well as local authority. So that gives you a broader perspective, which is fantastic. It gives you challenges with operating within two systems that sometimes don't come together that neatly. But the advantages are that you can look at, certainly say something like an area like mental health. You can then bring together the acute side and the community side, the social work side and the voluntary sector side. And we're putting together a mental health integration plan. And the voluntary sector are key to that. So things like the mental wellbeing hub that Rachel mentioned earlier, that is a key part of it, and we need to see the link with that as a preventative service that's helping the acute side out with the number of admissions. So that is really key, and I think this is where it brings it to life, so that we can work with all the sectors. Some are commissioned by the CCG, some by the local authority. Maybe one example is CCG commissions a couple of voluntary sector services on an annual grant basis. So we've given them a 2-year contract to give them a little bit more certainty to plan better. I'd have liked to have given them more, but the rules wouldn't allow me, but for local voluntary charitable sector organisations, give them some stability so that they have more confidence and can plan further ahead, and work with them, sort of psychological therapy services. So that's one side of it. Another side of it is working with say on learning disabilities, and Rachel's service are very proactive in ensuring that people get an annual health check. So we've brought GPs on board to promote that and work with other GPs in the learning disability field, so that we're looking to increase our number of LD health checks, because for that client group, in this crisis, the respiratory issues are high in that particular group of people. So we want to encourage that. So the integrated directorate approach gives us leverage on both sides of the clinical side and the local authority side. So that's been really, really useful. It's got its challenges like anything else, and it's fairly early days with the integrated directorate. But it's clearly the way that we need to be going to integrate services, and looking at a neighbourhood approach, or a better care coordination within localities across health and social care professionals, working with the provider sector and the voluntary sector is key to it all working out.
Yeah. And Mike,
sorry.
No, please, Abbie, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, because I mean, that neighbourhood approach is really interesting to me as to whether that means that you can reach out to smaller scale providers of services, so that some of the PossAbilities is quite large relatively, but it means that you can kind of reach out to smaller community groups and access those kinds of things, which I suppose during the pandemic, what we saw was lots of community organisations that wouldn't normally I suppose be kind of working in the community suddenly coming together, and it'll be your local football club or something actually really does something in the community. And I wondered whether it's not necessarily as extreme as the kind of football club, but it just allowing you to access providers that are smaller in scale.
Yeah, and I think that's something that will play out from the pandemic. Some of the key points will be to bring on on smaller providers. And I think Rachel mentioned earlier, we're reviewing day services, and I see that as part of the outcome of this review, that we're having, whether we're bringing into play more of the smaller organisations, and maybe buddying up with some of the bigger ones to make sure that they have the abilities to develop. And it is that opportunity to do that now. And maybe Rachel's put a good proposal in about how that's going to work out on a sort of a brokerage approach, which I think can work well. I mean, brokerage for use of personal budgets, it can be in one way it can be limiting, but we need people to do that role who can connect with smaller organisations.
There's a really interesting project that is just starting, I think, in London, which is trying to build a platform basically for an online platform, and a procurement platform, so that smaller organisations can effectively be commissioned by, partly as a kind of around the whole agenda around social prescribing, so that a GP can say, what you need actually is to go and do a kind of fitness course or whatever it is that people want to do, or various other sorts of support, which you could see smaller providers being able to provide through but you do need, as you say, you need some kind of framework around that, and to help them out with things like safeguarding and all of these things that we obviously need to be actually of a sort of Rolls-Royce standard, even though they're very small organisations.
Andrew, if I can just add on that briefly, I think what interesting conversation we've been having with some district council chief executives particularly is the the challenge that maybe large counties have in two-tier authorities engaging with those smaller kind of providers and organisations, because, you know, often for an organisation like a county council, they would seek to procure one provider to provide food delivery services to the whole of the county, when actually what we've seen, and I think what Mike has talked about in terms of the work of, say, Rochdale and councils that have the lower tier authority responsibilities, is that they're much more connected to the smaller groups and organisations that are vital in terms of actually working in communities and understanding, and that things can't be done just via one single big block contract. So, and thinking forward, and we don't quite know where the government's thinking is on this now, but where the government's thinking is on any potential future reorganisation of local government, it's really important that the connectiveness of councils like Rochdale and the district councils have with different communities and the very small groups that support them, that's not lost in a drive towards some kind of efficiency and larger scale unitary authorities across the country, because that's a real challenge.
Yeah.
I also just sorry, Andrew, just my last thing on this. The other thing that I think is really interesting about it is what motivates those smaller groups, because I think they're often not. I think they're often much more sustainable, because the people that volunteer for them and are a part of them get something back from being part of them. And so the fact that they also provide community support is almost a byproduct of what they're doing for their own sense of motivation and interest. And actually, when we think about what are the really strong community anchors historically, things like the churches and the schools, it's been because people go there for a completely different reason, but then get provided as a byproduct. And so you don't have that sense of sort of being done to, which is how Jamie and Andrew, I think, phrased this so well at the beginning. Public services are not about being done to, they're about, you know, being part of, and the byproduct is that you lose that sense of exclusion and isolation. And, you know, Rachel, what you've done so brilliantly is to create a place where people can come and receive support without it feeling like they're receiving a support. Actually, what they're doing is just going and seeing their mates and having a coffee, and, you know, there's not that kind of horrific thing of feeling like you need something and you have to go in order to be provided to.
I think that's a really good point about people's need to be seen as one of the good guys, you know, and providing help is actually a really, it's not a selfish thing, but it is a very self-fulfilling thing. And as you, I think, said, the fact that you're helping others is a really good byproduct of that. So there is a really virtuous circle there. Jamie, can I just ask you, thinking about other councils more broadly, I mean, could you comment on the strategic importance for a council's resilience of having organisations like PossAbilities who are under strategic contract with the council but have a foot very much within communities as well? They're almost like a bridge.
Absolutely, and it's that feedback loop that councils need. The kind of getting, I think Mike said it to me previous in a conversation, organisations that speak the language of local communities. So particularly in a time of crisis, you get that, and I know this with Rachel, but you get the message out through local communities, but then you get that message back very briefly from people like Rachel that know how the communities are going to respond to that. Just a very personal example, I worked for Nottingham City Council at the time of the riots. And actually, Nottingham had one of the best responses to the riots, sort of, you know, managed to manage it pretty quickly. And I think one of the reasons, sort of in those daily emergency meetings, I think one of the reasons we thought we were particularly good at doing that is because we still had those connections into communities, which meant we knew, the council knew who the community leaders were that could go and walk the streets and talk to the people who might get wrapped up in some of the disturbances, and stop them and talk to them and make sure that, yeah, and I think that's really, really important. I think COVID has highlighted that even more. How do you get information? We all know councils, and I used to write these beautiful surveys and press releases that you knew from the council would touch 1-2% of the population a day if you were lucky. Actually, if you want to get messages down to communities quickly, you need to have relationships with communities like PossAbilities that can disseminate that message quickly. And I think councils have appreciated that more and more as they've needed to get those messages and that strategy and what they're trying to do out of the door quickly. And as I said, then get that immediate feedback loop from people like Rachel, who can say, this is what my community's thinking, this is what I need more of, this is what's going on.
Yeah, just we've only got a couple of minutes left, but just to pick up on one of the questions that's come in on the chat, Mike, have you, hopefully to let us end on a positive note, have you seen any really good examples of the use of volunteering in response to the crisis, and things where people have really surprised you by numbers coming forward to help?
Well, yes. I mean, we were overwhelmed with volunteers, and from every part of our community, coming just offering from you know, a small amount of time to much more. People willing to answer the phone and help people out. People willing to go to centres to provide advice to people. People saying, you know, that they'll help walking dogs and things like that. The pandemic, I think, as we all generally know, it's brought the best out of people in terms of trying to help people in their community.
Right.
I think, you know, and as Rachel said, one of the big ones was staff going the extra mile where people can't come into day centres, and the staff going the extra mile to make sure that people are okay, even though they're not getting services, and just ringing them up and, you know, just checking them out.
Yeah, thank you. Rachel, you've got 1 minute if you wanted to add anything on that.
So I guess what we're just something that we're doing quite exciting with Rochdale Council, or we've done, which you touched on earlier, Andrew, about some other local authorities doing it, is that they have agreed a community asset transfer for our wellbeing hub. So, you know, this building was a liability to the council. You know, it was an old building. They've got no money to invest in it. So they have kindly handed it over to PossAbilities, and we've made it a really vibrant community space.
Yeah.
They've got land next to it, which they have also given to us under a community asset transfer. They've also given us a £1.5 million loan through the Public Works Loan Board, and we are developing 17 apartments for vulnerable adults, which will be built next year. So that's, you know, some really positive work that you can do with local authorities, just to you know, to support the community and improve the community where you work.
Brilliant. Well, listen, on that really positive note, I'm going to draw things to a close. So thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Abbie. Thank you, Jamie. And the recording of this will be available for others to see. So yeah, just leaves me to say thank you very much, everyone, and let's draw to a close.